Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. Hi, Noelle. Who's a good girl? That's a good girl. Welcome to the very first episode of Ranking Stephen King Decades, where I take a look back at all of the decades that Stephen King has written in, and I go and rank all of the books in each decade. And of course, the very first decade that he wrote in was the 70s, and of course his first book came out in 1974, which was Carrie. So the very first episode of this new series of mine, I will be ranking all of the Stephen King books written in the 1970s. And of course, while Stephen King is a very prolific author, he got a late start in the 70s. Like I said, Carrie came out in 1974, so he actually only has 8 books in the 1970s. So I will be ranking those 8 books. And then, of course, in future episodes, I will rank all of the books that he's written in the 80s, which that will probably be a 2-parter because I think he wrote close to 19 or 20 books. So that'll be a 2-parter. And then, of course, he wrote a lot in the 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and maybe I'll do like a mini episode where I look at the books that he's written in the 20s. The 2020s, not the 1920s. So yeah, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So like I said, there's 8 books I have to rank that he wrote in the 1970s. And for number 8, the very bottom, easily one of my least favorite Stephen King books. It's my least favorite Richard Bachman book, and it's Rage, but I actually don't have a copy because it's very rare. But I do have a copy of the Bachman books, and it is the first one that is collected in this collection, so Rage. Yeah, like I said, easily one of my least favorite Stephen King books. I know it has its fans, but I really can't get behind the premise. And I get that he wrote it in the 70s before school shootings were a very common thing in the US, but just the direction it goes in towards the end, I won't spoil it, but it's very unbelievable. And King is very good at getting me and fellow constant readers to suspend their disbelief for even just supernatural stuff. Like, he gets you to buy into it. But even with this book where there's no supernatural element, I just couldn't believe the things that happened towards the end of the book. And I get people explaining like why it could happen, but for me, it just doesn't seem reasonable. So, and I'm just not a huge fan of the main character or really any of the characters. And of course, Stephen King is terrific with coming up and writing great characters, not terrible characters. He wrote terrible characters in this book. But yeah, I'm just not a huge fan of Rage. It's not a book I'm going to be rereading a lot. I probably will give it another chance at some point. But for me, it's easily my least favorite Richard Bachman book. And it's definitely towards the bottom of my overall ranking list. So coming in at number 8 at my least favorite Stephen King book from the 70s, it has to be Rage. And coming in at number 7, this will be very divisive and very unpopular. And technically, I haven't read this version of the book, and you'll see what I mean. I'm talking about The Stand. And no, I'm not talking about the uncut version of The Stand, which was released in 1990. I think that's one of King's, if not King's most overrated book. I really don't like the direction it goes in. Part 1 is great, and then part 2 and 3 are just very boring for me, even though it does have great characters. But he actually first published it in 1978, and it was significantly shorter because the publisher literally told him, like, we can't publish a book this big. So they made him cut 100,000 words. So this version, which I have, which is the 1985 paperback version, it's like 800 pages. And I actually haven't read this version, but I do suspect that I would like it more than the uncut version because, like I said, one of my main problems with it is that it's so long and tedious. With this one, I feel like the editor cutting out so much extra stuff or stuff that seems unnecessary would make me like it a lot more than the uncut version. So even though I'm not a huge fan of The Stand, I do plan on reading this version eventually, and who knows, maybe it'll rank up higher than what the uncut version is. I don't know, but still, it's not one of my favorite Stephen King, so for now, I'm going to have to put The Stand, the original cut version, at number 7. All right, and this is where it gets hard because the rest of these books, the only 6 books I have left to talk about, are very good. I would give all of these books 4 stars. So it's very hard to rank like these next few books. My 2 favorites are easy, but these next ones are very difficult. But for now, I'm going to go with number 6, Salem's Lot. Now, this is King's second published work. I believe this came out in 1975, and this is actually his vampire story. He essentially wrote it as, oh, what if Dracula took place in Maine? And it is very good. It's a very good, creepy story. The horror elements are definitely on display here. But for me, with this being King's second novel, his character work isn't on par with what he would be at later, and even with his next published novel. So the characters aren't great. Of course, you've got the main character, Ben Mears, who's a writer. And of course, that's where it all starts with Stephen King using writer characters. He's fine. And then he's got a love interest, Susan, who's fine. The villain in here is pretty cool, or the villains. Yeah, I really like the villains. And like I said, the horror elements are very good. But overall, it's just missing something for me. And which is why it's never been like one of my all-time favorite Stephen King books. It's definitely one of my favorite King horror books. But overall, I would say for the 70s, it's number 6. All right, so number 5 on the list, we're going to go with a book that I recently just reread for the Richard Bachman read-along that I'm doing with my good friend Josephina, and that would be The Long Walk. I believe this came out in 1979 or 78. I can't quite remember, but either way, it's still a very good Richard Bachman book, one of my favorites. Not my favorite, that would go to another Richard Bachman book, which I'll talk about in the 80s episode. But anyway, this is a very good novel. He actually wrote this in the 60s when he was in college, I believe when he was 19. And what you get with this book is essentially a dystopian novel where you get 100 kids, 100 boys, and they're told that they have to walk. And basically, it's whoever's left standing. 99 boys get killed. One is remaining at the end, whoever stays walking the longest. And they get a prize of a lot of money and essentially just whatever they want. And so it's one of the very first, like, true dystopian kind of like game novels. Kind of like this is the Hunger Games before the Hunger Games is what I like to say. It's very good. It's definitely worth reading. I think I enjoyed it slightly less the second time I read it. The first time I read it, I absolutely loved it. But kind of knowing what is already going to happen kind of hinders it a little bit. But still, it's a terrific Richard Bachman book. Definitely recommend it if you haven't read it before. So for me, while it's not like one of my all-time favorite 70s King books, it's definitely a must-read for constant readers. So yeah, I'm going to go with The Long Walk for number 5. And speaking of unpopular opinions, this is definitely going to be unpopular because number 4, I'm going to have to go with The Shining. Now, of course, The Shining, classic Stephen King book. This is King's third published novel. It came out in 1977. And of course, it has the movie that came out in 1980. And yes, 3 classic Stephen King characters, Jack Torrance, Wendy Torrance, Danny Torrance, Danny Torrance, and they go stay at the Overlook Hotel while Jack tries to write his novel, and things happen. And we all know what The Shining is at this point, I hope. But yeah, it is very good, although the first time I read it, I loved it, but it was also that thing of like, I kind of know what's going to happen, even though it is severely different than what the movie is. I still knew what was going to happen. And the second time I read it, I liked it even less. So it's kind of one of those things where like every time I read it, I enjoy it slightly less, which its sequel is actually kind of different in that way. And we'll talk about that in a future episode. But yeah, for me, The Shining, it's obviously still great. It's got great character work by King, great horror elements from King. It's definitely one of his best books. But for me, it's just like a tad overrated in the sense that every time I go back and read it, I don't enjoy it on the same level I did as the first time. But it's still great, and it definitely deserves to be one of the higher books on this list. But I'm sure a lot of people would say that this is the best King book in this, not even in the 70s, just one of King's best books overall. But for me, there are a lot more King books that I enjoy more, so it is what it is. So number 4, I'm going to have to go with The Shining. All right, we've made it to the top 3. Now, if you're a good constant reader, you probably know which books I have left to talk about. Hopefully you're not super surprised by any of these. I love these books. Probably at least 2 of these would be in my top 10 overall King books. Number 3, we'll see. So let's just go ahead and talk about it. Number 3 is Carrie. I love this book because not only does Carrie have one of the best Stephen King protagonists of all time, it also has one of the best Stephen King villains of all time. And the protagonist I'm talking about is Carrie. And if you know the story, you're probably wondering, wait, isn't Carrie, isn't she the villain? But really the main villain in this, I believe, is Carrie's mom, Margaret White. Because she's just, for me, she's just a despicable person who just, I mean, I don't want to spoil anything, but she is the true villain of the story. And while Carrie does terrible things, the way King writes it, you can understand why she's pushed to do those things and why she's driven to do those things. So for me, it's a very conflicting story in that way, where you've got good characters doing bad things. So it's just really good King writing. And I know King fans, they probably like The Shining and Salem's Lot and The Stand more than this book, but I just think that King really knocked it out of the park. It's one of the best debut novels of all time. And so for me, that's why, for me, number 3 has to be Carrie. And for number 2 on my list for 70 Stephen King books, it's not actually a novel, it's a short story collection. And it's its very first short story collection that he published in 1978. And I'm actually running a Stephen King short story book club, shameless plug, and we just finished this a few months ago. We wrapped it up, and it was very good, obviously, because it's one of my favorites. But, of course, I'm beating around the bush here. We're talking about Night Shift. Yes, this is easily, well, I don't want to say easily. It is my favorite Stephen King short story collection. But, there are some really good ones, like Just After Sunset and Skeleton Crew, right? But this is probably his most consistent work. All of the stories in here, while they're not all top tier, they're all still really good. There is one that's meh, but the rest of them are really good. Whereas you get some of his other collections, like Skeleton Crew that we're reading right now for the short story book club, you get some really good ones like The Mist, The Jaunt, The Raft, and Survivor Type, which we're going to read here soon. But then you get other ones that are they're not that great. Here There Be Tigers, or you get really random poems like For Owen or Paranoid. They're not great, but for this one, Night Shift, I had a really fun time getting everyone's reaction out of it. I've read this 2 or 3 times now, and I love his short stories for the most part, and this is definitely his most consistent. It's definitely my favorite, and for that reason, I'm going to put it at number 2 on the list. And now we're at the number 1 spot. And not only is this my favorite Stephen King novel from the 1970s, it's also just my favorite Stephen King novel ever. I love this book. It's my favorite Stephen King book. And if you're a fan of the channel, you probably already know what I'm going to tell you here. And that's because it is The Dead Zone. Easily my favorite, and again, I keep saying easily. What the hell's wrong with me? It is my favorite Stephen King novel, my favorite King book. This barely made the list because it came out in 1979, right at the tail end of the decade. And yes, my favorite King book. It's got one of my favorite King protagonists in Johnny Smith. And of course, if you don't know the story, he gets into a car accident. He goes into a coma for 5 months. And when he wakes up with the ability that if he touches someone, he can see into their future. And of course, King goes into various directions with that ability. And it's just so good because King is really good at taking a story and kind of going in different directions with it. And I know some people kind of wanted him to stay with one aspect of the story, but I feel like the multiple facets, the multiple genres he utilizes for the story it's just so good. Like at one point it's sort of a horror book, and at one point it's more of a mystery, and then at one point it's a romance, and then you kind of get to the tail end of the book and it's like political thriller. It's all over the place, and I love it. It can feel disjointed at times, but I just love the characters so much, and I love the way King writes the story. And also, it's one of the rare Stephen King books that when I first read it, I hadn't seen the movie yet, because I grew up watching Stephen King movies, so when I was reading stuff like The Shining or Carrie that were also on this list, I had already seen those movies, so when I read the books, I wasn't too surprised by anything. But when I first read this book, I had actually never seen the movie, so I didn't know what was going to happen. So I was pleasantly surprised by my experience with it, and of course, still my favorite King novel, and I love it. Not only is it my favorite of the decade of the 70s, my favorite King novel overall. So there you go, there's my definite '1 spot. Surprising probably no one. All right, that is my ranking for all of the books that Stephen King wrote in the decade of the 1970s. Please let me know what you guys thought of this episode. Please let me know what you guys think of this series in general. I know I put up a poll and you guys voted for Stephen King adaptations. You wanted me to rank his adaptations. And this came in second, and it was fairly close. I thought if I did this series first, it would give me time to catch up on all of the adaptations that I want to see, that I think would probably make my ranking adaptations list, such as like Gerald's Game and 1922, and there's a couple other ones that I still haven't seen that I really want to see. But yes, that list and those ranking videos of adaptations will probably come after this series. And then of course, after I do this series, I plan on just ranking all of his books again, not in another like 10 episode series. I'm going to do it all in one video where I rank all of his books and just say like a couple of things about each book. So it'll probably be like a 20-minute video, and that'll just be like my definitive for now ranking list of all of his books. But for now, I'm going to do this either weekly or bi-weekly, where I rank all of his books from each decade. So yes, like I said, please let me know what you guys thought of my ranking, and definitely leave your ranking down in the comments below for how you would rank the 1970s. And of course, be on the lookout for the next decade, which will be the 80s. Now, since the 80s is like very prolific for Stephen King, I believe he has 19 or 20 books written in the 80s. I'm gonna make that a two-parter, be like 10 or 9 for each episode. I'm not gonna talk about 20 King books in one video. But yeah, that's all I've got for you guys today. So I really hope you guys like this video and this new series that I'm working on. And of course, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and the Bookastromer Discord. And if you'd like to further support me financially, go check out my Patreon page and see what that's all about. But anyway, thank you so much for watching, and have a terrific day.